Welcome to the Exoduscry podcast, where we have honest conversations around exploitation, trafficking, sexual culture, and justice.
Welcome to the Exoduscry podcast. Today we're joined by Chris McKenna, the founder of Protect Young Eyes, and a leading voice in the fight for digital safety and pornography awareness. Let's dive into the episode.
Chris, super honored to have you on our podcast. You have been investing in some really important work in this space of protecting children. That's a large umbrella, but it's something that's become extremely important for us at Exoduscry, especially as we've been looking at a lot of the issues going on in the world of pornography.
Right.
And as we start out, I just thought it would be helpful if you could give a little bit of background for who you are, what you're doing, just for our guests to be able to connect with you and your story.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, Benji, I'll start off by saying this is not what I'm supposed to be doing, right? I don't think many people wake up and choose to battle some of these monsters day in and day out, right? Yet here we are. So I'm supposed to be a partner at Ernst & Young right now. I thought that was my professional destiny. But in about 2009, I was called into full-time ministry. So I went to lead a large junior high ministry, so 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And that lasted until around 2016. But as a man who had also confronted my own compulsive use of pornography, and through accountability and the Lord and other just resources around me, was able to leave that behind, then I watched us put that monster in the pockets of children. Right? If you think about that time frame, 2009 to 2016, when I was in that role, that is the rise of portable internet, right? And so we put that in their pockets, and that terrified me. I knew there was good that we could do through it, but the risk didn't seem worth it to me. So I simply just started educating some of my parents. I put a small Facebook group together, did some research, but then that led to the launch of protectyoungeyes.com in 2015. Simply, again, just wanting to educate parents, good parents who simply didn't know what they were doing. They were analog in their understanding of the world and didn't appreciate the risks that were going along with the devices that they were handing their children. And that's the perspective that drove me. To me, it's this balance of risk in the lives of our children, right? I have 4 children. Mm-hmm. And in leading that ministry, I know we can't eliminate risk from the lives of our kids, but I want to eliminate the risk of egregious harm. And so out of that came a website, and then churches and other schools coming to us and saying, hey, talk to our families, talk to our kids, educate. And that's led to where we are today, doing 400 to 500 presentations a year all over the country, even some internationally. I have a team of presenters. We just want to inform, to give parents who know their kids best the tools that they need to guide and prepare them for the digital world that is inevitably going to show up at their door.
So good. My head is already spinning a few different directions. I just want to respond to what you opened up with, because I think that's just such a accurate perspective, and I really relate to it. In other words, that not many of us, or any of us, grew up dreaming of one day fighting porn, right? Or, we're looking, talking to, the job fair person about going to anti-trafficking school.
Right.
Those conversations weren't a part of our growing up, and yet by virtue of these things that have, these realities that have emerged in our world, has necessitated a response from the faithful. And I'm a huge history person, love reading about history, and I'm always amazed at some of the characters that emerged during times of war. People who were skilled farmers, or people who were skilled lawyers, or people who were skilled in some trade. Mm-hmm. Real family people feel the call to go to battle, to fight evil, and to preserve good and freedom. And that's always amazing to me to think about, how people adjust their lives to respond to the urgent call of what's going on in their generation. And, I look at pornography as an invading alien force focused on destroying mankind.
That's right.
That sounds dramatic, but I really believe that to be true. And so with that perspective, it only makes sense that there would be those of us who see that, who recognize that, and want to respond and do everything that we can to stop it. And when you actually get into the research, it's easy to see, like, when war's going on, limbs are being blown off, territories are being compromised.
Sure.
There's an obviousness to it that is compelling and visceral. When it comes to something like pornography and the poisoning of the mind and the soul, it's more difficult to see right away. And yet so much research now has gone into uncovering the harms that pornography does to children. And so we are left in a situation where we as a society have to decide, what are we going to do about this?
Definitely.
And I would like to know, in your experience, first and foremost, how you faced down your own struggle with pornography. There are a lot of people out there. There's a perspective out there of acceptance. In other words, the idea is like, well, every man's just going to struggle with this, and there's almost like this acquiescence or this fatalistic kind of acceptance that, guys, it's just this kind of the struggle. And I've heard from so many men who feel totally defeated. There is no real hope of ever totally overcoming this. It's just something that you manage. And, I always take exception to that because I feel like I have walked in freedom in this area, and I feel very grateful for that. Hearing stories like yours, it gives so much courage to people out there who think this is hopeless. And so I would love to hear about your journey in that.
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line, Benji, was I was a worse, less satisfied, sad, hopeless version of myself with pornography. A man who I used to work for at Covenant Eyes, my supervisor, actually, his name was Scott. He used to say the phrase that pornography, unlike many issues that tend to target certain demographics or certain types of people, pornography is an equal opportunity destroyer. It does not discriminate. It doesn't care whether you're rich or poor or what your cultural background or heritage or religion, whatever it is. It comes after us in a deep brain, physiological, emotional, relational, whatever aspect you want to point out as a human, it comes after us in all of those ways. And I found myself impacted in all of those ways. I was exposed to pornography as a young boy, probably somewhere 8 to 9. I can't pinpoint the exact time, but I can pinpoint what it was. And that has almost always been true in all of the men and women and teens that I've spoken to over the years. You always remember the first experience. There are brain reasons for that, which is why it makes it so important for us to urgently come against this problem so that we're not causing our children to live with these shadows, well into adulthood of the things that they see. But that led to a curiosity that was just unhealthy. I didn't know what to do with it, right? I mean, we're created, designed to crave the things that porn is showing us, right? It's just a horrific junk food, toxic version of the goodness that is being portrayed. I just didn't know what to do with that. I tend to be a bit of a compulsive person anyway. My wife is the brakes, I'm the gas, right? And we have a good balance that way. And so I know that about myself. And looking back, I can see why I was so vulnerable to what I was seeing. And I didn't even have the internet yet. So then now here comes the internet while I'm at college, and that AAA engine, right? Anonymity, affordability, and accessibility that I've heard, many talk about over the years destroyed me. It was something I could not control. And for years, binged and purged and struggled and just, like the cycle you hear over and over again. You're in and then you regret and you're good for a little while and then you fall because I didn't have any of the resources around me. So I could pinpoint where I was on the sidewalk on 60th Street in Grand Rapids on a long run. I'm a runner, where I was listening to a podcast, a sermon podcast. And for me, and I know this isn't everyone's experience, but for me, it was truly an epiphany moment where I just knew, Benji, beyond any doubt, that it was time to say it. It was time to go home. It was time to sit down with Andrea and tell her, a decade into our marriage, what it was that was standing between us. And her response, gracious and forgiving and amazing. I will always just remember that moment, right? That's another amazing moment. But now the distance that we had experienced in our marriage had a name. It had a label, right? Because no matter how well you think you hide it, no matter how well you think you're not, that it's not hurting anybody, you always are. Always, whether it's the screen, the person, the human behind the consumption that is being harmed, which, I mean, obviously a lot of the work of exoduscry is puts so much light on that reality. That person who is consuming it is harmed. I was less of a father. I was less of a husband. I was less of a leader in my church. I was less of a human, because it is dare I say, it's a selfish bastard. It is an issue that only wants to consume you neurologically. It wants every bit of the attention and the affection that you're willing to hand over to it, and it will always want more. And so it was time. And through that admission, right, you've got to put it in the light. Everything in darkness controls. Secrets are toxic to all of us. But putting it in the light was the first big step. And then surrounding myself with other men. Because what you often find is that as soon as you say that this is it, you give somebody else as John Acuff says, the pleasure of going second. And then they get to say, wow, really? You? And so I was able to find a small group of men, at 4 of us, every Tuesday or Wednesday night after we got the kids to bed. It was 9:00 in a basement, struggling and fighting this together. It was through software, Covenant Eyes, which allowed me to put that internet activity in the light. It was basic things that you might call parental controls, but even on my iPhone, that 4-digit code that would lock in limited alt websites, handing that over to a friend, right? All of these things, because porn does not give up ground easily, not without a fight. Sexual sin is the devil's playground, and that's where I believe a lot of damage to humanity is going on at all levels. And so as I say to people, right, it's one thing to come clean and to speak openly and to put that out there, but then get ready. If you thought the fight was intense in the struggle, get ready for the fight that will now take place for your heart and mind as you try to let go, and that issue does not want to let go. It does not give up ground easily. The fight then continues. And so I found myself in that, and that was 15, how many years ago, now. And so I guess my message in that is, a struggle doesn't have to be a definition, right? It doesn't have to be the end of the story. Another pastor that I listened to said that when our misery can be turned into ministry or into goodness, there's power, in that. And so to wrap all the way around, the motivation of Protect Young Eyes, honestly, at its core, was I did not want those amazing 11, 12, and 13-year-old young men and women who are in front of me in ministry to become me. I did not want them to become the adult version of me. And I had none of what they had at their disposal, and yet I struggled so mightily. What chance did they have as amazing junior high students with this monster in their pocket if I didn't do something? So that's how it all sort of wraps together, and the motivation behind it.
And because you experienced it not as something sexually liberating and gratifying, but as something that was, in a way, on one hand, inescapable, and on the other hand, so deteriorative of your mental and emotional state.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on some of that? Like those feelings of like how porn actually made you feel, and like what was the compelling factor where you go, I've got to help other kids stay away from this?
Well, I mean, as an adult, when I just extrapolated, here I was an adult man who supposedly had all of these resources around me, right? I was active in my church. I had an amazing wife, right? I had a child, my daughter, right, at the time. I knew the Lord, right? I had all of these things, these tools around me. I was successful in business, right? All of these things that you would on the outside go, okay, and I should be able to manage and to control myself. And I've always been a very high motivation, sort of self-driven individual, could achieve most of the things that I put out in front of myself. And yet this one thing proved that none of that was helpful, right? And so with all these tools, I mean, that was the thought, the permanent thought I couldn't get out of my mind. They had so much less in terms of equipment and tools and just experience, and yet we had put the exact same thing in front of them, right? And so we expect children with their young developing brains during this unique developmental time that will never happen again inside of technology that was never designed for them, inside of digital spaces that are so neurologically compelling, crafted by the most brilliant software engineers on earth. And when they make decisions like children, we get upset at them. Sherry Turkle, who's an author and has spoken about these things, she said, to me, that this is like her saying, she said, that is a perfectly predictable response to a perfectly tuned machine, right? Where pornography lives is a perfectly tuned machine to grab our attention in the most compelling ways, to show up in pop-ups right in a curious moment if you're a young child doing homework, and to weaponize the very goodness of their curiosity in a way that ultimately leads them on a path that they can't stop, right? It is perfectly tuned to grab us. And so when I thought about how vulnerable I was as a grown man to all of those different ways that it's tuned, again, that's just the feeling was somebody has to do something. Somebody has to let parents know that Instagram isn't just a picture app, that Snapchat isn't just cute filters, that in all of these digital spaces where there is the possibility for good, there is this egregious harm that is also possible. And that's what's so complicated in the digital age that we have today. When you and I were growing up, the difference between where porn was and where porn wasn't was pretty obvious. Those places in our childhood. It was some physical place you had to go to. It was some magazine hidden somewhere. It was some destination, something. And the places where childhood was good and pure and innocent and fun was often very separate from those places. I sometimes joke in the parent talks that I do that if I was going to watch some scrambled Cinemax VHS tape at a friend's house, like you needed a spreadsheet and an elaborate plan and diagrams, right, to pull this thing off in order just to get that peak or whatever it was,
so
right?
True.
And that's so different than what we're expecting our children to navigate today. We're the exact same places where we're asking them to do a Google search for a history presentation is the exact same digital space where I can see pornography, those mixed content places where good and that evil also lives. That's an incredibly difficult, stressful, place for a child to grow up today. So all of that just lives behind sort of the spirit of Protect Young Eyes and why I'm so motivated just to say to as many parents as possible, this is the reality, right? And we have to jump in.
Totally. Just a couple more questions about your own journey, and then I want to fully pivot into your work because I know that's why you're here to talk about your important work.
Sure.
It sounds like, in describing your own story that just getting to the point where you could just confess it all, be open about it all. Just let someone else know the struggle that you were wrestling with was a huge part of the turning point for you. And in your case, it sounds like you shared that with your wife. Can you describe kind of why that was so freeing for you and how that helped you?
Well, I think that, we are better in relationship, right? We are better when we are in communication. We are better when we are sharing openly, when we can talk about the things that are difficult, when we can, as I said, just put it out in the light. I believe that those things that we sort of place out there in front of us often almost always have less control over us as humans. And I found that to be true in my own life, to put that out there. And, as I speak to kids in the talks that we do, none of them will solve problems of self with yourself, right? Self-help is good, but a bit of a misnomer. That can only take you so far because self got you there right in the first place. And so for me to put that out and to keep saying it, right? Here I am, well over a decade later, still saying it to you, Benji, because I know, right? It's a struggle that doesn't have to define me, but it is a struggle that has created a vulnerability in me, neurologically, emotionally, relationally, that I know is present, that I am more susceptible than many other people out there who haven't struggled in the way that I have to fall back into the issue if I'm not careful. So a part of keeping that in my rear view, as I say, it's back there, but it's in my rear view, and keeping it in its place as a struggle is keeping it in the light, is continuing to have conversations. It's not a one-time event, because then there will be other struggles and those triggers will show back up. And so I would encourage anybody is to talk, and then to keep speaking, keep embracing that original sort of freedom by sharing it with others in your circle of trust, whoever that might be, but to keep talking about it. For me, that's what I've found has been so helpful, is to continue to have conversations like this and to be encouraged years later.
That's so good. I think that's the battle for a lot of people out there, is just starting that initial work of opening up and finding somebody safe to share this with. It's weird how porn has this alienating, isolating effect on consumers. We're actually working on a documentary right now about female exposure to porn, because as isolating and alienating and stigmatizing as it is for men, imagine what female consumers go through.
Right.
Where females don't struggle with porn. And it's a man's issue. But what obviously you and I know that's not true.
Right.
Everyone struggles with porn. Meaning men and women struggle with porn. And so I hope that people listening to this will find inspiration and freedom in your words to actually be able to sit with the struggle that they feel so paralyzed by, and find the courage to go share it with somebody.
Yeah, if I just want to elaborate on one quick point on that, share it with somebody, because what I have found, and even in talking to others, is the motivation to want to say something is a pretty fleeting thought, because it's so terrifying. So the thing that I share is, in the moment that you feel as though it's time, whatever it is, that epiphany. For me, it was that mark on the sidewalk that I could walk to today, to say that was the spot. Make as many irrevocable decisions as possible in that moment. Things that you can't take back, that hold you accountable for following through. It could be a quick text that just says, I've got to tell you something when I get home. Whatever it is, in that moment, do as many things as possible that will hold you accountable to following through, because the window that is cracked open in that moment is very narrow, and it closes quickly, because there are so many other emotions and things that are going to try to convince you not to break out of that. And so that's advice that I was given, that I share as often as possible, is to do things you can't take back in that moment, so that you will follow through on a really difficult thing.
What I love about your story and the way that you tell it is you had so much potential as a person, as a husband, as a father, as a successful business person. And yet this struggle was compromising or holding back part of who you were becoming as a human.
That's right.
But by getting free from that, have positioned yourself to be used in such a way to affect this battle in a way that you probably had never ever dreamed of.
That's right.
And what I love about that, and I love to transition at this point into a lot more about your work. But what I love about that is again, for our listeners to see that light at the end of the tunnel, to take courage from, it's not an issue of now you're disqualified, therefore you might as well just keep going. Get free, become the best version of yourself, because in my view, God has a plan for people's lives, and darkness has a plan for their life. And when we come into the light, I think that our plans are the purpose for our life begins to get activated and begins to accelerate. And so I think your story is very inspiring. But let's talk more about Protect Young Eyes, and would love to hear the important work that you guys are doing and what you see as some of the key battlefronts right now.
Yeah, and I was just provided a great example of how that story, right, of mine was able to lead to light somewhere else in some of the work that we're doing at Protect Young Eyes. I was recently contacted by a mother who had discovered that after 2 years, so her son had been struggling in silence on an unprotected device in his bedroom for 2 years. And this had finally come to light. And what happened was mom's heart kind of knew something was going on, sort of suspected there was something going on, right? You never doubt a mama's gut. And so she had been having some conversations with her son, just trying to press in and just to get him to talk. And he really, really wasn't. And she shared my story because she had watched Childhood 2.0, the documentary, where I shared about my exposure as a child and how then that became something I struggled with, but was able to break free. And so she shared with her 8th grade son the story of Mr. McKenna and what I had experienced. And 2 days later, he came to her and said, "Mom, Mr. McKenna's story is mine." Right? So that just happened. And to me, that was, if Protect Young Eyes over the last 8 or 9 years was only intended for that conversation, good.
Yeah.
Good. Because now we're able to talk about it, and now we're working together, and here he is struggling to break free, but it was because that story. So
it's so great.
So that's the motivation again behind it, to give parents the tools to know at the different levels. We talk about layers of protection that we want to wrap around our kids. It's not just one approach or one conversation. It's multiple layers of protection. And, those conversations, that's one of the things we press into heavily in our talks with parents, is getting them to press into the conversations early and often with their kids so that they can have these kinds of productive conversations with their kiddos. So,
by age 13, most kids have already been exposed to porn. This disturbing, very often violent content is not only traumatizing children, it's toxically rewiring their sexual templates. More than ever before, we must protect our kids from the life-altering consequences of underage exposure. That's why we launched the Protect Children Not Porn campaign, calling for laws that require porn sites to use ID-based age verification to ensure its site visitors are at least 18 years old. Since we launched the campaign, 10 states have already passed this law, and many more have introduced it, but we need to push for all 50. Sign our petition at exoduscry.com/PCNP so we can protect millions of children from porn.
The story of humanity is not one of perfection. And, I think that even in cases where we're presented with someone or somebody's story that appears to be perfect, I often wonder, is that real? So much, and in many cases, what I've been learning recently is no, that was not real. The story of humanity is one of trying things on, one of feeling the sting of, is the kettle hot? And feeling the sting of that and learning from that. It's one of growth. It's one of evolution. It's one of constantly learning. I heard old proverb, knowledge is learning something new every day. Wisdom is letting go of something every day. And I think, that's so much of our story. And, but oftentimes how we can learn together is through the sharing of our stories. And with my own kids, I don't want you to have to try all the things on that I tried on.
Yeah, that's right.
Let me help you learn from some of what I've grown through. And so I think there's a lot of power in just like what you said, just sharing your own story and allowing that to really impact others who hear it. And that's so inspiring that this young boy found himself in your story and is now on that same path of getting free.
And, parents, what I really want them to hear is, I think we make it a lot more difficult than it needs to be. As I say to them, they would be surprised at what qualifies as a porn talk. It doesn't need to be a PowerPoint. It doesn't need to be elegant. It doesn't need to be elaborate. They don't need to clap when you're done, right? It doesn't need to be all of these things. And a part of it is just getting them to understand how natural it can be to equip our children to believe, as we say, that we are the ones where they can land safely and softly no matter what. Driving to school, pulling into the pickup or drop-off line, right? Turning down the radio and captive audience. They're not going anywhere, right? They're strapped in. And you just turn and say, you know what? If you ever see something is sent to you, even if you make a decision that you know isn't right on anything connected to another human being online, number one, I'm not going to freak out. And number two, you can always bring that to me.
It's good.
Turn up the radio and keep driving. As I say to parents, that's a porn talk, right? It doesn't have to be awkward. It just natural little moments, drip them into their lives.
Yeah.
We say 10 before 10. We want 10 porn talks before a child turns 10. So I don't want anybody listening to this freaking out because your kid's 9.5. You don't get to strap them to a chair and say porn 9 times and call it good. That doesn't count.
Yeah.
But I want these natural just drips in their lives, car time, mealtime, bedtime, wherever you can find these spots to drop in these little natural reminders. And just that simple invitation that you can always land safely and softly with me, no matter what. I say to parents, I want you to say that so often to your children that they're rolling their eyes and finishing your sentences. You become the algorithm. You become the persistent, consistent reminder against all of the others that are constantly jockeying for their attention and affection. Be more persistent than the digital algorithms in their lives by saying those things that matter over. There's no such thing as too much, over and over and over again.
That's so good. Just normalizing it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a phrase that tends to rile people up. I'll sometimes say that out of context in a presentation to make porn the norm. And that freaks out an audience a little bit. But then I frame it and tell them what I mean by that. But if you can have a conversation with your kids about porn while making pizza, good, you're there. That's the kind of thing where I want them to be able to say the word and to bring it to you and to, again, keep it in the light, not impute our own discomfort as adults because we weren't maybe modeled that. We often weren't from our own parents. Don't impute that onto our children. They're often ready before we are. We can't wait until we're ready. And so we've got to get it done.
Absolutely. I have had a number of calls from other friends who are parents in the moment of discovering their child's porn use, panicking, asking for advice. What do I do? And, some of these friends full well knowing what I've been doing all these years. We've never really had a conversation about it, but all of a sudden, now that they're in it, it's like, what do I do?
Call Benji. Yeah.
How do you handle those conversations? There's a parent, they're in crisis. They've just discovered their child is viewing porn. How do you advise those parents to walk that situation out with their child?
Yeah. So first, it is a question of, well, what has already happened? Has there already been the freak out, screaming moment? Because there may be some repair that has to initially happen in order to rectify that. So that's a first question. I often encourage parents to see what happens next in two big buckets. There are relational things that need to happen and technical things that need to happen, right? And we put solutions into both of those buckets. Ultimately, it comes down to something really simple. In our experience, Benji, digital trust is a bit of a secret sauce in homes. In homes that have high digital trust, digital friction is often low. And the number one way to build digital trust in all different areas, whether it's pornography or wherever it is by not freaking out, not freaking out, not freaking out, not freaking out, right? To remain calm. And so as a parent, right, a lot of this is on us. We have to accept the reality that if your child has something connected to the internet, they will eventually make a mistake that you don't like as a parent. It's inevitable. They're connected to 100 million people and we put it in their pocket and we expect them to never make a mistake. That just doesn't make any sense. So we have to accept the reality that they are going to make a mistake. Our reaction then, in that moment that a mistake is made,
Punish them.
Exactly. You took the words right out of my mouth. It's as if you're reading my mind. In 20 years of working with young people, I think they need to know the answer to two questions almost immediately in the moment of crisis. Number one, am I going to be okay? And number two, are you still okay with me?
Oof.
And moms and dads and caregivers and professionals, we sometimes answer those questions before a word even leaves our mouth. It starts here. It starts with our posture. It just starts with us. And so what I want as many parents as possible to know is that we are the ones that get to direct how this goes. They are going to make a mistake. That we can't change. The direction of this depends on us. And so if that means you got to go into your room and write down all the horrible things that you hope never happen to your child online and then say them out loud in the mirror, and then after each one of them say, I'm not going to freak out, not going to freak out, right? For us to practice, because our emotions never make us a better parent. Our anger never turns our child into a better version of themselves. They know they messed up. They don't need us to remind them. They need to know that they're going to be okay, that no matter what, they can land with us, that nothing they could ever see online would ever change the way we feel about them, would ever change our love for them. But what kind of parent would I be if we didn't change some things, right? So there's this balance between grace and truth that's always going on, but you lead with the grace, you lead with the love, you lead with the I am still here for you.
That's good.
And then you follow it with the things that have to change. Again, because what kind of parent would I be if I didn't try to remove the monster from you that just bit us? And I think if you lead first with the, you're going to be okay and I'm still okay with you, they'll listen to those sort of changes with a lot more understanding instead of leading with the hammer. If you lead with the hammer, they'll never hear the love. And so I think that order is really significant in that conversation for anybody who, has a kid, again, connected online. So that when that happens, right, you're not locking them in a room and yelling at them through the door because you've practiced this, right? We want our kids to practice what to do in those moments when they see something, right? Put it down, tell someone, and we practice. But we can't just tell them that. We also have to practice what to do in those moments, because if we allow ourselves to just respond and we don't think about what we're going to say, then you're going to say something you regret, almost always as a parent. So,
yeah.
And what I started to talk about and then sort of got detoured another way were these buckets of relational and technical solutions, right? So relationally is sort of where I was at, covering kind of how do we pursue authentic connection. That's one of our values that we teach at Protect Young Eyes, to pursue authentic connection with our children. But then on top of that, we do very practical, technical things So you ask curious questions about what they saw, how they got to it. And working most recently with this one family, it was having mom and dad actually look through the search history. Like, I think you just want to delete it, right? You don't want to, but history is actually very important to understand what they were looking at, what they're curious about, how they got there, so that we can wind it back and try to prevent that from happening again. I mean, I know you've had Jay Stringer on here where he talks a lot about exploring the curiosities, exploring the path, so you know what to do. The same is true in this moment with our child, to explore the path, because there aren't a lot of kids that just wake up over Pop-Tarts in the morning and go, I hope I end up on Pornhub tonight and get busted by my parents. But that's not what happens. It's a bunch of micro decisions and sort of a path of slow fade from where I'm supposed to be to where I'm not supposed to be that happens. And so if we're going to effectively prevent that from happening again, it's important with curiosity in the relational side so that we can make effective technical changes to prevent that exposure from happening again. Was it YouTube? Was it social media? Because it's not just all the traditional places, right? Enough studies, Common Sense Media, right, has shown us that I think it was 38% of kids who are actively consuming pornography find it through social media, right? So it's not always just the traditional places. So we have to identify those so we can stop, close those doors, and do some of those technical things, whether it's routers or software or location changes, right? Never in the bedroom, these sort of things that we need to change in the lives of our kids.
On that note, on the legislative front, dealing with porn, is there legislation that you are favorable towards to help mitigate this crisis of childhood exposure to porn?
Yeah, there's a lot happening right now, which I'm thankful for, because all layers in what I'll call the tech stack, and I'll explain what that means, all layers are failing our children, right? So whenever we look at an iPhone or look at an Android, there's a lot in a stack behind that shows us what we're looking at, right? You have the internet service providers, the large organizations that are streaming information to us. You have domain name providers, right, which are selling the sites and are hosting that information. You have app and, say, software developers, right, who are building websites and applications, then environments where that content is being viewed. And then you have the devices themselves, which is then the doorway, the portal, right? So there's all these things that are going on to create the content that we're looking at or to show us the content. And every single one of them is, one, not designed with kids in mind and is therefore failing our children when it comes to pornography. So currently there's a wave of a number of states, who started in Louisiana through Representative Schlegel, with age verification, right? That websites that have over a third of their content as explicit have to age gate that through some sort of validation through an ID or some sort of how old are you to be 18 or older to get to the content. Excellent. Does that layer in the stack need to be doing more in order to prevent our children from seeing this content? Yes, just like we treat them in the physical world where IDs are necessary to get into different places. So I absolutely support that as legislative effort. But it is an enforcement nightmare when you're asking attorneys generals to try to police all the millions of different websites that are out there that have more than that 1/3 of content in order to ask them to go after them to age gate, right? I love seeing that Pornhub is pulling out of certain states. That's a win for all of humanity. But that is one of so many websites that are not age gating, even though this law has been passed. So what I'm a huge fan of is then let's do more at the top. The devices themselves in the hands of our children are the least restrictive means of controlling this content. Because even though we don't like this, pornography is constitutionally protected speech. Not obscenity, but pornography, right? There's different legal that I'm not going to get into, but in the hands of children, we have a different duty of care in order to protect them from this content. And so I've worked very hard with the National Center on Sexual Exploitation to create device-level Children's Device Protection Act, where every single device used by a child, even used by us, there's 3 things that are true about it. Number 1, it knows where they are. Number 2, it knows their age because of the Apple ID or the Gmail account that is attached to the Android or the iPhone. And it already has a filter on it. So why not just enable it for children? When you know that a device is being activated by a child based on the age of the Apple ID, if they're under 18, shouldn't the filter automatically be turned on? That just seems like common sense. So that's the layer. So at that device and at that website layer, those are 2 places where I definitely support doing more. That the creators of pornography must be doing more to prevent children from viewing the content, and also that the creators, the manufacturers of the devices that are being used by our children every single day also need to be enabling what is already there to protect our children in a much more deliberate way.
Why isn't that being done?
Right? It's so common sense.
So who's responsible for that? Apple?
Sure. Right. Apple, Google, you could say Amazon with Fire tablets, right? Those sort of portable devices. The technology is there, Benji. We know it. They can tell you how many times you rolled over in your sleep last night, right, on your Apple Watch. There is nothing that they can't do. Their genius knows no ends when it comes to engagement and interacting with us. All of these things are simple and possible.
Do you know if this conversation has reached Apple executives?
I don't know for sure. I know they're aware of, I know they're aware of the legislation. I know for certainty that Apple as an organization is aware of this conversation. I know Google is because their lobbyists show up in the meetings that I'm in. So they're definitely aware of the conversation.
It seems like such low-hanging fruit.
It's a no-brainer. And to me, what's so important about legislation like that is it prevents the early accidental childhood exposures that are so harmful, right? 58%, Common Sense Media's report, that 58% of children ages 13 to 17 who have seen pornography, it happened accidentally.
Yeah.
And 63% of those, it had happened accidentally within a week of when they were asked the question on the survey, right? And so it's these automatic filters in places where we know children are. If we know a child is using a device, then everything should be done automatically to filter the content. Parents shouldn't have to hunt and go through the 30 different steps that it takes right now in order to set up all the different controls, you know, through screen time on an iPhone or et cetera, that it takes right now.
What does Apple, what does Google stand to gain by not doing this? I mean, it seems like so obvious that we should all participate in the protection of children. There's no dispute about what pornography is from the standpoint that this is for adults, you know, and I mean, of course, I have objections to that, but it is by some literally called adult entertainment or, you know, adult content, whatever. Again, I have my own objections to that, but there's my point is that there's a collective agreement that this is not appropriate for children. In the same way, there's collective agreement around, you know, the age of that it's appropriate to purchase alcohol, and yet Apple, Google, other tech companies have shown an unwillingness to participate in very low-hanging fruit measures to do that. And I guess, the question is just, what do they stand to gain by not doing that?
It's a great question. I think part of what is causing it, which isn't an excuse, is that we live in the wake. Well, we live in an environment here in the United States where we haven't passed any meaningful legislation that protects children online for over 25 years, right? You really have to go back to the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act in 1999. What was that, 4 or 5 years before MySpace, right? Whatever that was, right? In order to point toward anything meaningful that we've passed to protect children. And what that did back in 1999 was based on the digital risks that were present, right, over 2 decades ago, that set age 13 as a digital age where marketers could begin to target information to individuals, right? It was meant to protect them from targeted advertising. But what has happened over the years is that all of technology, every app, everybody now misapplies that which was intended for that purpose, which was marketing and targeting, to content. And it treats all 13-year-olds as digital adults. That's the mindset, right? So that's why age 13 is set for Snapchat, right? That you can have an account supposedly if you're 13 or older. Same thing for all social media. It's because we live in the wake of that decision, which has been conflated to apply to all digital spaces, that every 13-year-old, seventh graders, that all seventh graders are okay to live in every digital space because of that law. That's the mindset that creates some of those reasons why. I'm sure.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I think that's a part of it here. And, Benji, if I could tread a little bit into a slightly more nuclear part of this conversation is, I don't believe that there is consensus with everybody that teens shouldn't have access to pornography. That there is a healthy version of that is a right that teens should have for exploration or whatever you want to describe. That is not a universal agreement that it is not meant for children. I'm not going to apply that to your question directly.
Yeah.
What is their motivation? I can just tell you and I both know
right.
that is a part of this conversation that also makes it messy.
Where have you guys seen the most traction in the work that you've been doing to help protect children?
Well, we are seeing a wave of parents who are definitely starting to pick up on the fact that delay is okay, right? One of the phrases that we use is delay is the way at Protect Young Eyes. One of the most effective ways technically to prevent early exposure to pornography is to simply not put them in digital spaces where the risk of harm goes up. And delay is one of those, to delay smartphones until well into high school if possible, to delay social media into that driving range if possible, neurologically. Maybe they're more ready for it then. And just by simply doing those things, I believe you're going to decrease that risk that they're going to run into something by a multiple or of whatever. And then you couple those technical decisions with the constant relational, because as we say, even if you've said no, you have to teach your children as if you've said yes, because we don't control all of the digital doorways that our kids have access to. So even if you've not given them a smartphone, have not given them social media, have not given them whatever, you still have to engage them about, well, if you run into and have these conversations as if they had it, so that when they run into that through a friend or through another place, they know what to do. And so we are starting to see more and more parents make that choice. It's felt, like you're a bit of a parent on an island if you were the one who was waiting. There was recently a book released, The Anxious Generation, which is doing excellent, that I think is causing a lot of parents to see that the research 10 years later here is starting to catch up to what some parents have known for a long time. Again, don't doubt that mama gut. Mamas have known for a long time that there was something that didn't quite feel right about their children being in these digital spaces, even though they felt this sort of collective pressure because of society, because of their child being the only one. Nobody wants their child to be the only one without something.
Right.
It takes a pretty special, diligent sort of parenting to be able to be okay with that. And that's too much pressure for some. But I think we're starting to see that tide turn where more and more young parents are deciding to come together and to wait together so that you have this group that is doing this thing instead of the group going the other way. And that is really, really helpful.
What do you see as the appropriate age for a child to have a phone?
I don't want them to have a smart device until high school.
Okay, so
I want to
15, 16.
Yeah, I want to keep junior high. To me, it's those precious junior high years.
Yeah.
That no junior high student is a better version of themselves emotionally, spiritually, relationally when they have algorithmic and internet connected technology in their pocket. That's what I want them to wait on.
That's good. I know there's a lot of research to back up and support what you're saying. We're not getting into that right now, but for parents who are listening, I know there's a lot of pressure on parents because of my child, does their homework through their phone or needs to get updates or stay connected to their friends. There's so much pressure to cave to getting their child a phone at 10, 11, 12 years old, 13 years old. But the consensus of research about its effect just on the brain, on our socialization is so alarming. And so I hope that parents will feel armed by this conversation to make some of those difficult decisions to protect their children. As we kind of steer towards the end of this conversation, I want to just give space for you to highlight anything that you guys might be doing right now that others can participate in, either in terms of, training that's out there or legislation you guys might be pushing for, or how can people who are stirred by this conversation get connected with Protect Young Eyes and the work that you guys are doing, or just even get a hold of the resources that are available?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the website is always just the easy spot to come to, but we share a lot of these just little nuggets that we've shared here today, Benji, in our social media. We're pretty generous with making that as available as possible. As I mentioned, we do have a team. I have a team that has been trained up both for students and for parents, but also even I do half and full day professional development sessions for whole groups of principals and educational professionals in that way, where those live trainings are something that we specialize in and have put a lot of energy into the engagement around those and the presentations and the information that we're sharing there in as many schools and churches and nonprofits as possible. And so we have a whole process dedicated to that parents can be a part of. But I know that's not a reality for everybody. And so we've just recently have taken that parent content and have turned it into an on-demand version that parents could consume on their own if they want. And then sometimes a follow-up from that is because tech questions come up, because not every parent understands that thing called a router behind their couch that they haven't thought about since the guy or lady installed it, right? But they know how critical it is. So we also have a community, a private community called The Table that has tech support. That if parents have just simple questions around, hey, what pop-up blocker do I use for Chromebooks, or just whatever it might be, these are the kinds of questions we get. Then I have Abby and others in there who are answering these one-on-one tech questions with parents as they have them there, because they come up and you need help and we want to get to them as much as possible. So at kind of all those different layers, we want to be that resource, be the one who can jump in and help a parent who's feeling lonely or feeling isolated or is in that moment of crisis. The Table is also very good for that. There's a spot to send a direct message that Abby and I get to immediately. And there's emergency guides in there for my kid has seen porn, my kid is in a predator situation, my kid is in a mental health crisis, my kid has received a nude photo, whatever it is, these kind of emergency situations. We try to handle those quickly, as quickly as possible. So that's where that takes place. So at the institutional level, at that kind of learning level, or at that help level, those are the places where we would love for parents to come and interact with us.
That's so helpful. I know that a lot of people feel overwhelmed by technology. And so the idea of like, how do I, update my router?
That's right.
An overwhelming thought. And it's amazing that you guys are there serving parents in this capacity to make it doable, to insulate your children as much as possible with wisdom to protect them from the dangers that are online. Super grateful for you joining us on this podcast. I know there's so much more for us to unpack, and so I'm sure we'll have you back again
Thank you.
Yeah, I just
Thank
really
you.
want to express my own personal gratitude to you as a parent, making it possible to protect our children. And it's just great to fight along people like yourself in this space as we work together in different ways to protect children. So thank you, Chris.
My pleasure, Benji.
Yeah.
I've really
Awesome.
enjoyed this. Thank you.
You can check out all our podcast episodes, articles, and films at exoduscry.com and join the daily conversation by following Exodus Cry on all major social platforms.